All right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome to the Benjamin Dixon Show. Well, you know what? I'm going to let her introduce herself because I do a pretty bad job of introducing people. But I want her to come on, and I want you to welcome Rania Khalek. And I heard her on. First of all, I've been reading her tweets for a little while, and I've read her articles for a little while. But I had a chance to hear her on the Majority Report this week, and I reached out to her and told her I had to have her on the show. Rania, how are you? Thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on. It's good to be with you.
I'm sorry. I think that's my fault. Say that again. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me on. It's really good to be with you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for joining us. So before we start talking about politics, tell everybody about yourself. Introduce yourself. I'm sure my listeners already know who you are, right? But again, I want to give you a chance to let you speak for yourself.
Well, if they don't know who I am, like you said, my name is Rania Khalek, and I am a journalist. I write for the Electronic Intifada. I typically cover issues related to Israel-Palestine, but I also write for other outlets here and there as well.
I like your bio on Twitter. You said you're a journalist with an opinion. And, I appreciate that candor because I think people fail to realize, or not people, I think journalists fail to realize that in some capacity, they do have an opinion. So, what made you say that? Do you run into that often where you're expected to not have an opinion?
Well, I mean, I think journalists in general are expected to not have opinions. It's sort of the mainstream idea of what journalism means. But I am totally opposed and reject the idea of objectivity. I don't think it's possible to be objective on a number of issues. I think it's natural to have biases and opinions, and I prefer to be honest about that instead of pretending to not have one. And I also think being objective oftentimes ends up serving power because you end up, instead of just telling your viewers or listeners or readers what the facts are, it ends up being this game of he said this and she said that, and I'm just going to leave it to you to decide because I just want to stay objective and neutral. And there's some issues you just can't be neutral on.
I'm trying to think who I was reading this week that actually made that point so clear. There was an entire piece about it, or maybe it was a series of tweets where they were discussing how this position of neutrality actually is not really tenable when you're dealing with certain issues. And they brought up the example of NPR, right, where NPR tries to give both sides of or tries to make it seem like there's two valid sides of an argument, and then when they're done, it's kind of a wash. And I have to find out who that was because everything you just said reminded me of that, which is why I have a lot of respect for journalists, but I'm glad to be doing commentary because I have so many opinions. I don't think I can make it a day.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's no. I think there's certainly a place definitely for straightforward reporting that's important. But when it comes to issues like climate change, for example, and that's one thing that like you mentioned, NPR and other news outlets did for a really long time. They do it less now, but they used to treat the climate deniers as though they had valid opinions when 99% of scientists say that climate change is real. And so the issues like that, it skews the way that the public ends up viewing very, very serious and important issues. You have like a significant portion of the public that believes climate change isn't real because they're being told by people that are being presented as people with serious opinions that it isn't. And so, yeah, that's where it starts to be very dangerous, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was the quintessential example for me. And then we're going to talk about politics in a second. Well, this is politics. We'll talk about the race in a second. But the quintessential example for me was when I was listening to NPR and they were doing an interview with Ted Cruz, and they allowed Ted Cruz to use the fact that his mother was a scientist as justification for him opposing NASA climate data and dismissing NASA climate data as something that was wrong. And he was right because his mother was a scientist. And at that point, I just threw my hands up. I'm like, come on. You can't try to be that unbiased that you can leave something like that hanging in midair. So I think it's a perfect example. But yeah,
it's a huge reason why the right has been able to make a lot of the arguments that it's made for the past couple decades is because they've been treated, some of their ridiculous and most absurd arguments have been treated as legitimate by the sort of like, we have to treat both sides equally frame of thinking.
Yes. Absolutely. Great. That was a bonus. That was for free. I didn't realize we could have that conversation. That's a clip by itself. Great commentary there. Let's talk about the race. I had a chance to read 2 articles of yours. One in The Nation, where you co-wrote with, I believe, 3 other authors. And then the piece that you wrote for the site that you write for, both of them dealing with the race and Hillary Clinton. It's really, I guess there's like 3 different angles that I want to come from, but I want to ask you first about the Nation piece. And in the Nation, you were discussing how the question was whether or not you could support Hillary Clinton. And too long didn't read. No, you said, you know, if I read it correctly, it seems like you just straight out could not support Hillary Clinton. And you listed quite a few reasons. Tell me a little bit about that piece. And did I hear you right?
So the argument that we're hearing a lot from more like progressive-minded and liberal pundits is that if Bernie Sanders does not win and Hillary Clinton is the Democratic nominee, that it's no question. Of course, you'd have to vote for her because look who she's running against. And they usually point to Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And so my argument to that is, well, when I look at Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and assuming that lesser evilism, right, is the goal, I can't actually tell who the lesser evil is. Mm. I mean, obviously, when it comes to language and rhetoric, it's pretty clear that Hillary Clinton is much less offensive, right? Mm-hmm. She's more respectable in her tone, and she isn't, she's not riling up the sort of fascist sentiments that Donald Trump is. Although I do think that Hillary Clinton has played a role in creating and the conditions that have given a rise to a lot of those sentiments that are coalescing around Trump with her corporate policies. But I'll mention that in a second. But the point is, when it comes to comparing the two, I mean, you've got someone like Trump who's saying he wants to ban Muslims, which is very, very bad. But then you have someone like Hillary Clinton who has actually bombed, like who's actually supported policies of bombing Muslims and supports more policies that include bombing Muslims. And so we're being told to choose between someone who wants to ban Muslims and bomb Muslims. And to me, that is a choice I cannot make. Those are 2 atrocious outcomes that I can't decide between. And it goes beyond that, and I can go further. And you look like you have a follow up to it.
No, I'm just listening. I'll jump in there. Go for it.
Well, beyond that, I mean, just in general, when it comes to issues of world stability, Trump is being presented as somebody who's very dangerous in the sense that, he wants to do really bad things around the world. And that's not necessarily wrong, but Hillary Clinton is extremely hawkish and arguably more hawkish than Donald Trump. In fact, her political leanings when it comes to foreign policy and her record put her more in line with neoconservatives, the people who brought us the Iraq War, than any sort of liberal-minded person. Whereas somebody like Donald Trump has been expressing more isolationist sentiments. Mm-hmm. Where he's talking about reducing America's military presence abroad. And this is something that he's consistently said. And I'm not in any way, let me be clear, advocating for Donald Trump because he says that. My point is just to say that when you compare the 2 on that issue, on foreign policy, Hillary Clinton is somebody who has played a role in several regime overthrows, particularly during her time at State Department and the coup in Honduras, which was completely disastrous and has led to record levels of violence in that country that sent children fleeing for their lives. And then when those children from Honduras came to the US and crossed the border on journeys that were very, very dangerous, that's how desperate they were, Hillary Clinton came out and said that those children should be sent back. She advocated for deporting children who had come from places like Honduras back to the violence that they fled to send a message to their parents. And that was a violent level of violence that she contributed to causing. And that's something she's not sorry for. That's another thing is, she regrets the Iraq war vote, right? She rejects regime change in Iraq. But at the same time, it hasn't changed her going forward. She still supports the coup in Honduras and still defends it, which she did in her Daily News article or her Daily News interview recently. And she also supported regime change in Libya. The war in Libya, the bombing of Libya and the overthrow of Gaddafi is a policy that Hillary Clinton spearheaded. That is the only reason the Obama administration did what they did in Libya, because Hillary Clinton persuaded them to. And it was an absolute disaster and has led to conditions that have given rise to ISIS inside Libya. So this is an ongoing pattern with Hillary Clinton that she doesn't oppose. She has not she hasn't expressed any regret. In fact, she still believes in the righteousness of U.S. regime change and says so. So that's very, very disturbing to me. She's a very hardcore militarist that, and then there's the other issue, which we can get into more, is Israel. I mean, she has aligned herself not just with Israel, as most U.S. politicians do. She has aligned herself with the most hardcore right-wing elements in Israel. That is very, very disturbing.
Let me jump back here, because you said something that I don't, talking points are very powerful. And I'm not minimizing what you're saying as a talking point, but it's a hell of a talking point. You have one candidate, if it comes down to Trump and Hillary Clinton, one wants to ban Muslims, the other one wants to bomb Muslims. That is a tremendous indictment against this decision that they're trying to force us to face, right? And I don't know if many people have just heard it that simplified, and I think that's what makes it very, very powerful and hit me like a ton of bricks when you said it. Ban or bomb, and then the question you got to go one step further and say, will Donald Trump have the capacity and the authority to actually implement that policy? No. Does Hillary Clinton have the capacity and the authority to continue her policy? Yes. So, you make a hell of a case right there. And I don't think I could push back on that particular instance of your argument. But I do want to unpack it a little bit more, because your politics, and I read your tweets and I read your works, your politics leans progressive. So how do you, in this climate of Hillary, feminism, progressivism, but you would abstain from voting for Hillary Clinton, how does that fall in your life, in just your world in particular, with other progressives, with other liberals, with Democrats, and feminists? Like, you have to be a pariah in a certain extent.
Here's the thing. I don't blame people or fault them, especially like the other liberals and progressives. I understand if they come November decide to vote for Hillary Clinton against a Donald Trump type figure. Like, I totally get that, and I respect that. I'm not telling other people not to. I'm just saying I can't in good conscience do it. And I think it's important to recognize why, because I'm not the only person who feels that way. And so I think it's an indictment of our political system. The fact that you have people feeling as disillusioned as someone like me does, to where if it comes down to bombing Muslims or banning Muslims, I mean, if that's all we're being offered, it speaks to the fact that, we don't really live in a democracy if there's not a candidate that a significant portion of people feel represents any of their views. And in many ways, I mean, Hillary Clinton, in some cases, yeah, sure, she represents some of my views in this, but they're really shallow views, like she speaks in a nicer way, sure. Like, and in terms of just, being, respecting diversity, I guess, if you will, things like this, like the more respectable tone she has, I agree with, yes, more than I would a Republican on the abortion issue. So there are those kinds of issues that are important to like recognize and understand. And that's why, I mean, I don't fault other people who would vote for her, but I do at times feel like a pariah when it comes to this kind of stuff, especially since, I mean, there's a number of reasons. First is the issue of that Hillary Clinton's a woman, right? And so if you're not a woman, or if you're a woman and you're not voting for her or supporting her right now, that comes down on you. And then there's the fact that Bernie Sanders supporters, which I am one of them, are being portrayed as like these white guys. And I'm not a white guy. Like, I'm not a white guy. I feel like in a lot of ways I'm being ignored in that sense, to try and portray him as some sort of like white leader of like a white pack. And it's not fair to do that. But I also think that there's something more troubling happening on like, not necessarily all of the left, but a segment of the left and liberals, which is this sort of obsession with language that bothers me. And that's when it gets to the identity politics. And that's what really frustrates me, especially as it's really frustrated me throughout this election, is the way that everything's discussed and talked about in terms of like, especially with Hillary Clinton. I mean, it's almost like there's a grad student that's writing some of her speeches. She's using the language of intersectionality and white privilege. I mean, could you ever imagined in a million years Hillary Clinton asking white people to check their privilege repeatedly? I mean, she did it today again, telling white people they need to listen to black people. I mean, I'm not necessarily against those things, but at the same time, you're like a multimillionaire who's done really terrible things to communities of color. Like, how can you sit there and talk about that? And then there's also this whole idea of this, a lot of Hillary Clinton supporters are using that sort of identity politics to try and shut down class issues and discussion of economic inequality. And, that's where like I'm more Marxist leaning in that sense. I'm a socialist, like, and that bothers me, especially because class and race are so mixed up go ahead.
Let's back up and unpack that, because you've hit on something that I talk about ad nauseum on this show. I like it drives me insane. One, yes, she had to have hired, somebody tweeted it out a long time ago. Props to whatever PhD candidate got the job as speechwriter for Hillary Clinton, right? Because they have been lending and loaning Hillary Clinton the language of intersectionality for the last, I would get at least the last 6 months of this race, right? So she's hitting all the points on intersectionality, and she's doing it seamlessly, and it's so perfect in some cases that you realize it's absolutely not her, especially when you see her unscripted and you see her reaction and you see the way that she has this condescension that just flows naturally from her, so much more naturally than her tweets. That's number one. But then two, the other thing that you hit on that I want to unpack is their usage of this language of, I guess, intersectionality again, of respectability, not respectability politics, but identity politics is what I'm looking for. This language of identity politics to the detriment of class. And I think it has created a fissure, a division in the party or in this left-leaning side of America, where you're either going to focus on identity or you want to focus on class. And I think it has been just so exposed by this race in particular because of Hillary Clinton's manipulation of identity politics. I just want you to unpack that a little bit more and some of the examples that you've seen and why it frustrates you, I think, as much as it frustrates me.
Well, there's a number of things she's done. I mean, one of the most notorious is saying that, is breaking up the big banks going to fix racism? Is it going to fix homophobia? Is it going to fix sexism? No. I mean, these kinds of things where you see how neoliberals like Hillary Clinton have been able to use the language of identity to shut down issues related to economic inequality. And that's what neoliberalism really is all about. It's all about hiring Black and brown CEOs to say, we fixed it, you guys, like we fixed it. That's the problem. That's why, I mean, that's what the Democratic Party is about and has done for a while now, is it's pretty right wing when it comes to economics. It's been for several decades since, Bill Clinton came to office. It's completely abandoned working class issues, and everything is about language and how you talk and making sure you use the respectable kind of language. And that's where identity politics comes in. I mean, I think identity politics, maybe there's a place for diversity, of course. Like there should be more diverse, boardrooms. There should be more diverse, the Congress should be more diverse. The cabinet of the president should be more diverse. We should have presidents who aren't white men. Yes. At the same time, I think it's really important that we recognize how in a lot of ways that is how the establishment has been able to dupe us into thinking that we're making progress, when in fact, when it comes to economic inequality, it's been the complete opposite. You've got, larger, wealth inequality is higher than it's been in decades, it's like things like this. You have people who are like really struggling to get by, the middle class is shrinking, people are getting poorer. These, this is very important to recognize and understand because, and I think it is, I think this election has really brought it to the fore. And I think with a lot of the more prominent pundits that you see arguing in favor of Hillary Clinton, it's easy for them to see diversity as the answer to everything, to see just having more Black and brown faces as the answer, because they don't have to deal with high health insurance costs. They can afford to pay for everything. They don't need free college. I'm talking about, like the people who are most hardcore in the news media that are for Hillary. They don't have to deal with these things. So it's easier for them to just kind of push that aside and just be about, we want a woman president, yay. But like for millennials, though, especially I think you see the numbers of women millennials who are, like 70% for Bernie. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that millennials are struggling more economically than, our parents were, or even like a couple, or like one generation above us is. And so it's just really frustrating to see the conversation go that way. But I think it also is very good. I've been a critic of some of the some of the way identity politics has functioned on the left, especially on college campuses. Like, I've been somewhat of a critic of that. And I do have to say it's really refreshing that college campuses are actually, you know, the most vibrant and electric places for Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Because I think that demonstrates a rejection of the way that neoliberalism tries to use identity politics to get people on the left to support the Hillary Clinton type figures.
And that has been, here's the problem, right? The problem in my opinion is that, you know, there have been so many fights that we've had to fight in regards to identity, you know, for minorities, for the LGBTQ community, for, you know, just across the board. There's so many issues that we've had to fight that needed to be fought. Yes. But now it's at the point where they've taken it to a level where it has become useful against their own party, against their own, and I guess what the thing that really is sobering is that you have to come full circle and say, if they're so willing to use identity politics to the detriment of what we thought were their values and their progressive values, you really have to ask yourself, did they ever have these progressive values in the first place? Because it looks like, to me, this primary looks like the death pangs of liberalism. Like neoliberalism is fighting for its life. It's fighting not only for its life, but it's fighting for control. And it's just kicking and flailing its legs and arms, to doing everything it can to suppress progressivism. And now I'm like, did these people ever believe this? Was it just always a convenient mechanism to usher in a right-leaning economic Democratic Party?
I mean, I think for the Clintons, it's the second thing. It's a lot of what you said. They've never been progressives. I mean, they came in, you know, they're a part of the wing of the Democrats, the New Democrats, right? And they came in with the idea of really getting rid of that more progressive agenda to be centrist, so that they don't, you know, so that they don't lose the country, you know, after the country was really conservative back in the 80s. And in order to win it back, they wanted to veer right instead of stay left, you know, and that's what happened. And so, and at first, you know, I think one thing that's really interesting is that under Bill Clinton, I think what the Democrats tried to do, or the New Democrats tried to do, is they tried to employ the Southern strategy in their own way. Like, again, you know, like with the way that Bill Clinton, tried to get white working class voters to come back to the Democratic Party. And it didn't really work. And so instead they ended up, you know, aligning with corporate, you know, like the corporate America. That's the Democratic Alliance became corporate America and minority voters, and then more progressive minded white people. And that's kind of how it's been for a while. But I think that that's cracking right now because of the economic situation in this country. And I think it's been to the detriment of everybody, because a lot of the people I think that are coalescing around Donald Trump right now are people that have been completely abandoned by the Democratic Party. I'm not excusing the violence and racism we see at Donald Trump rallies. However, I think it's important to understand that Donald Trump is also using an identity politics, right? Yep. He's employing identity politics by appealing to racism and xenophobia, and he's appealing to people who are doing poorly right now, people who are hurting, and you know, whether they're putting that anger and pain into the wrong place. I mean, you have to recognize that white working class and poor America is hurting right now. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really short-sighted, especially when I see like the more Clinton type voters. It's really, really short-sighted to just kind of dismiss all the Donald Trump voters.
Yeah.
Dismiss all those people as just racist people who shouldn't be reached out to at all and can't be saved in any way. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that's why this election's so important, because you know, if you really want to beat someone like Donald Trump, you have to understand that the movement he's created, the momentum he's created, it's not going to go away once he's gone, and it's going to go somewhere. And I think the message that Bernie Sanders is offering is kind of like one of the few antidotes to the sort of anger that you see around Donald Trump. And Hillary Clinton is just the epitome of everything those people hate, right? Like, she's just this establishment corporate.
Yeah. Politically correct, identity politics, pandering, that, you know, she is, I can't reiterate that enough. She is the epitome of what they hate about liberals, about the Democratic Party. But you hit on something else here, and let me know, you know, you just throw the flag up when you have to go. you hit on something else. This idea that we are often as progressives jumped on because we see some redeeming values in the people on the right who have economic gripes, and they have gripes with how this system is working out. We're foolish enough, I think we're naive enough to think that we can convince them that the solution is a more progressive solution versus what they've been propagandized with for a very long time, to think that it's a more conservative solution. I think that might be some naivete, particularly for people like me. I think we can convince them. But from the identity politics side of that conversation, you know, I know you've been jumped on for saying what you just said. Like, you know, why would you go after these people who are racist? Why would you go after these people who are xenophobic? Why would you go after these people who want to ban Muslims? All so that you can get Bernie Sanders elected. What does that look like in your experience?
Well, you know, it's frustrating because, you know, I do get jumped on for that kind of stuff, but like, here's the thing is when it comes to, if you know, there's not very many progressives in this country. I mean, just in sheer numbers, if you do want to change anything in this country, you have to recognize that you do need to be able to reach out to other people besides liberals who speak your language. Mm-hmm. It's like in sheer numbers, we just don't make enough. We're not enough of the country to force what we want to happen. Mm-hmm. But on top of that, you know, if we want things to change economically, it's like, you got to be able to organize people who want the same things you do in that sense. And so that's like, when it comes to class, that's an issue that the majority of people can organize around. I mean, that's kind of what socialism is all about, is when it comes to class, it's like class interests typically end up trumping everything else. No pun intended, but they do. And so it's really like, it's important to be able to reach out to those people because of that, because of the fact that they have a stake in wanting free healthcare. You know, they have a stake in wanting rich people to pay more taxes. They have a stake in free education. And that's what's important, not to like try and convince them out of morals, but just the basic, like everyday survival issues. You know, there are similar stakes that we have. But beyond that, you know, I think it's actually like, there's also like, if you don't want, so I think that neoliberalism is actually creates the conditions for fascism. It really does. It creates the conditions for hatred. It creates the conditions where you can divide people and really like help and appeal to their really worst sensibilities, which is what someone like Donald Trump is doing. And so I actually do fear that another 4 years of, or even 8 years of someone like Hillary Clinton, passing more trade policies that are detrimental to U.S. workers, and also lecturing. I mean, lecturing poor and working class white people about using proper language. It's just going to make them angrier, it's the kinds of, and especially with her condescending, like, attitude towards things. I think it's really going to create conditions that can give rise to a demagogue even more dangerous than Donald Trump. And that's what I'm trying to convey and say when I say these things. I'm not trying to say that we should be reaching out to the KKK. That's like not, that's not my point here. But the point is that I do think that people, beyond what the media does show us, when it comes to the people who are supporting Trump, they are also supporting him for reasons that have a lot to do with reasons that people might support someone like Bernie Sanders. And it's because they're hurting economically, but in the case of Trump supporters, they haven't been given a framework for understanding their condition, because we don't really have a left in this country that has a big platform. And they've been fed, these stories by places like Fox News about why the economy is doing poorly. But when you offer a counter narrative to that, it can be powerful. And I think it's that needs to be understood. And maybe that's naive on my part, but I think that history actually shows us that, appealing to people's economic situations is a way to actually bring people together.
I think it's naivete, but I'm foolish enough to just be naive and still fight it anyway. I honestly believe part of the problem is that we have intentionally weak representations of progressivism in the media. And I use that phrase specifically because at first I thought they were weak just because they were weak. But I think at this point it's intentional, because they don't want real strong progressive voices represented in the media. And you could see the classic case of Cenk Uygur being chased away from MSNBC, because those counter narratives that really could latch hold into the minds of the common threads that we have with poor white working class people who tend to identify as conservatives. They don't want that solidarity to ever come about. And so for all of my life, and I'm guessing all of your life, all we've had is this watered down neoliberal economic version of progressivism, which is going to lead me to my last question here. Why aren't you, I have a suspicion, but why don't I see you more on CNN and MSNBC? And because you have a large following and you have a really strong voice, but we don't get to hear from you on national media much.
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. And one of them is what you just explained about, sort of limiting how far progressivism gets to go in the mainstream media. Mm-hmm. But the other issue is that I cover the issue of Israel-Palestine, and I'm very vocal about where I stand on that. And, I'm very much pro-Palestine, I'm pro-equality. So I'm pro-Palestine. I'm very much against the way that Israel functions. And so because I'm very loud about that, that does put me in a position where I do get boxed out, intentionally so. And that's the case for a lot of people who cover the issue in a similar way that I do. And I mean, I don't just cover Israel-Palestine, but it's an issue that if you do speak out on it, I mean, just look at Bernie Sanders talking, just all he's done the past couple of weeks talking about Gaza and just saying that people, civilians in Gaza were killed and Israel used disproportionate force, which is what every single independent investigation by the UN, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, any organization, even Israeli human rights groups, you name it, have found. Just him saying that has invited this intense backlash against him from figures in the mainstream press and from even Israeli government officials, which is bizarre. But yeah, so I mean, just looking at that, you can see there's a lot of hostility towards any sort of opinion that is challenging towards like the status quo and the consensus around the Israel-Palestine situation, which is presented in a completely distorted way in the US media. So unfortunately, those are the two reasons I just get boxed out. And I think that happens to a lot of people on the left who have similar opinions that I do.
And I'm chuckling because that's the number one tactic. But there's a shift. I think there's a shift in the momentum of new media, online media, as well as a decline in mainstream media, particularly these outlets that claim to be the progressive voices. So there's obviously there's a, to use a capitalistic term, there's an opportunity, right? There is an investment opportunity because there's a big gap in terms of progressive media. And the question is, will anybody come in and seize that opportunity? But I digress. That's a whole different conversation. Rania, thank you so much for joining me. We probably, actually, there's still a whole lot. We didn't even talk about the second article, but I want to bring you back to talk about the second article, Hillary Clinton and her AIPAC speech and her relationship to the far right wing in Israel. I definitely want to unpack that. So can I get you back on the air another time?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on. This was a great conversation. And your show is wonderful. And the things that you're talking about are so important. So I appreciate that as well.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I really tell everyone how they can get up with you and where they can find you.
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Rania Khalek, and then also I write pretty regularly at the Electronic Intifada, and I also my website too. I try and post my work there. It's raniakhalek.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much, and I look forward to having you back. This is Rania Khalek, ladies and gentlemen. Go follow her on Twitter and all the places. We'll be sure to share all of your links. Thanks so much for joining us.